Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of History Hack. You have me, and I'm flying solo yet again. Everybody has abandoned me like we abandoned Chris only a few months ago. But today, my guest is Bryan, who's a director of the Brunel Institute and a historian who specializes in the history of the Great Western Railway and works of Isambard Kingdom, Brunel. And he's here to talk to us about his new book, Iron, Stone, and Steam. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Really interested in getting to know a little bit more about this because everyone knows when it comes to something technical, I am the wrong person to be talking to.
Well, don't worry. I mean, my book hopefully is more about social history than technical history. So I know how steam locomotives work, but there are plenty of better people qualified to do that. So hopefully, my book is more about the 19th century and Brunel and the impact that his railways had on the world then.
Well, it's a really important time, especially you had the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian period, everything was booming. So this is the ideal time to be writing about this.
Yeah, it is. And Brunel was lucky that he was in not quite at the start of railway development, but he came in the sort of almost the second wave of railways. So he was, really leading at a time when it was all very new, not just for engineers, but for people themselves. And I think we forget the impact that railways had on the wider population, because of course they'd all been used to traveling at the essentially the speed of a horse-drawn vehicle, if they were lucky, or a horse-drawn cart. Whereas, when the railways came, they could travel, from London to Bristol in 5.5 hours instead of a couple of days on a bumpy stagecoach. So, we forget, we've got rather blasé about the impact of technology, but when you think about, railways were almost like the internet revolution. It shrank the country when railways started to really take off.
I think you can still find that today, especially railway travel, considering in England, not as much, but for example, in Eastern and Central Europe, we're constantly upgrading our trains, our train lines, and everything else. And for example, a train ride to my parents that takes 4.5 to 5 hour drive takes 3.5 hours by train, which is incredible in itself. But then you've also got train lines like, for example, Warsaw to Berlin, which takes 6 hours to drive, and it takes 6 hours on the train. So there you haven't got so much of a development and being able to be opened up plane ride, only an hour, by the way, which is so much more convenient. But anyway, enough of my rambling. Let's talk about Brunel. So tell us, what was Brunel's engineering experience?
Well, when he came, because he started his work on the railway, on the Great Western Railway in 1833, but before that, his background was not really in railways. He had, as a young boy, had been sent to France by his father, and of course his father is a really pivotal part of the story. Mark Isambard Brunel, who was, probably arguably as talented an engineer as his son. He was an émigré from the French Revolution, fled to France, came back from France, and then started to work in the naval yards. He invented a machine for making the blocks that you see on ships for rigging. And that's how Brunel ended up being born in Portsmouth, of all places, in 1806, because his father was working in the naval dockyard there. And he was, Isambard Jr. was sent away to France eventually when the revolution was over to have a sort of technical education. Interestingly, university education, he did spend some time with a prominent clockmaker called Breguet, who possibly gave him that idea of an attention to detail. But he was self-taught. He came back to England and ended up working in his father's office in London, working on all sorts of projects, bridges, and then obviously he came to fame really working with his father on the Thames Tunnel, which was a project to build literally the first foot tunnel underneath the River Thames in London. And it was there that he sort of learned his trade. And I guess in a way, his whole career was predestined by his father, who always wanted him to go into the family business. And so I don't think Isambard really had much choice but other than being an engineer. And so he started working on the Thames Tunnel. It was a very difficult project to work on. You can imagine digging a tunnel under the Thames, very close to the surface. The water kept bursting in, and eventually in 1828 there was a serious flood, and Isambard himself was injured because he'd ended up working in the tunnel because his father found it so difficult. He was supervising engineer. He was washed along the tunnel in the dark. Can you imagine how frightening that must have been to have been washed along a tunnel and washed off into a side tunnel and then rescued by one of his team, who'd literally grabbed him by the collar and stopped him from drowning. And so after that accident, he had to go and do some recuperation, and eventually ended up in the city of Bristol, which is where the story really starts. A time when, you know, people used to go to Bristol to take the waters, a bit like they did taking the waters to go to Bath. There's a place in Bristol called the Hot Wells, and Brunel came there, spent time, and as an engineer, he really grubbed around for work initially, looking for various things, but won a competition to build a fantastic bridge across the River Avon at Clifton, the suspension bridge. That brought him really to the attention of merchants in the city. And that was really how he ended up getting the job as engineer for the Great Western Railway. But he'd not really worked, amazingly, he'd not had much experience in railway engineering per se. I found when I was doing some research, he had a job interview for a railway called the Newcastle and Carlisle, which is right up on the border in Northumberland, which he didn't get. And he did a few other tiny little projects of surveying, but he didn't have much experience. And I guess probably at that time in the early 1830s, there weren't that many railway engineers around, because railways were very new. So you had the Stephensons and some of the engineers up in the northeast of England. So when the merchants in Bristol wanted to have a railway built, you know, they didn't cast their net very far, interestingly, and I found no evidence that they approached the Stephensons to build their new railway. So Isambard was interviewed initially to do the survey of the railway, and got the job in 1833.
Out of curiosity, do any of his projects still stand? I mean, obviously before he became a railway engineer, does anything still stand today?
Well, the Thames Tunnel is still in existence, and in fact, there's a great museum called the Brunel Museum in Rotherhithe you can go and visit. So that's still there, because again, the tunnel was a long project that they ran out of money. Wasn't actually finished until 1843. So you can still see that. There are a few dock works that he was involved with around the country, one in the northeast that still survives a little bit, but not much evidence. He tended to do very, small contracts. He surveyed the route of a railway from Birmingham to Gloucester, which in the end they didn't use his work because it seemed to be too expensive. But there's not much evidence of much he did before he really came to prominence with the railway. Of course, the suspension bridge, certainly for people who live in Bristol, is a landmark. And again, that was a project that started in the early 1830s and took a long time to be completed, and was never completed in his lifetime. Wasn't actually opened till 1864, after he died. Like many Victorian engineering enterprises, funds were always quite, and it was easy enough to get the money to start these projects, but to finish them sometimes was a lot more difficult. And but the bridge is a symbol. I mean, it's certainly a symbol of Brunel, and it's a symbol of the city of Bristol. And he called it his first love. But work really only struggled along, certainly in the 1830s. And by the time he got involved with his railways, he was less involved with the bridge. So it's really that more modern in the 1840s and 1850s heritage that survived.
So moving on, he actually does start his career with Great Western Railway. How does his career progress? What does he end up doing?
Oh, that's a big question, because he did so much. I think that's one of the things that's so unique about Brunel, is that he was a true polymath. He could turn his hand to almost anything, and I think the period of history that we're looking at, engineers had that opportunity. As the century progressed, engineering became much specialized. So you would have a mechanical engineer, or you would have a marine engineer. At the time Brunel started his career in the early 1830s, engineers like him were able to turn their hand to, all sorts of things. So Brunel started, he was appointed, as I mentioned, the engineer of the Great Western Railway in 1833. But by the end of the 1830s, he'd also designed steamships, he'd done bridges. Brunel was able to do all sorts of things, and he was a very restless person looking for new opportunities. And that was one of the things why he was so creative, in a way that he was able to embrace new technology. He was attracted by new technology at the time. So as well as being a great engineer, he was also very adept at picking new technologies. They weren't all successful, and we can maybe talk about that a bit later on. But he was certainly a man to be going forward rather than going backwards, and certainly somebody who was never really happy to repeat himself, and also not to necessarily repeat what other engineers had done, which again is one of the things that makes him unique.
So he ends up proposing a line, doesn't he? What makes this specific line architecturally different than any of the other propositions that are going on in the country at the time?
Well, I mean, his job really was literally to survey the line from London to Bristol. The merchants had wanted to link themselves with the City of London, because Bristol at that time was losing out to Liverpool as a major maritime centre. In the 17th and 18th century, Bristol had been a really important port, clearly funded by the slave trade and by the trade that came from that, so tobacco, sugar, that kind of thing. But certainly by the 1830s, Liverpool had become a much bigger and a more important port. And one of the reasons why Liverpool had become important was that it was linked to Manchester by a railway. And of course, that was the thing that really spurred people on in the city. And they realized that, this was where they needed to be. So in terms of your original question, the thing about Brunel's railway was, it wasn't, I mentioned this just a little bit earlier, it wasn't like any other railway. He invented almost a complete railway system. So he wanted, he called it the finest work in England. That was his description of the railway. And he decided he would create a conception of a railway. So it would have its own distinct track, its own distinct route, its own distinct stations, locomotives and rolling stock. So it was a complete railway system, and it wasn't a carbon copy of the kinds of things that Robert and George Stephenson had been doing elsewhere, which is a positive and negative. But I've been thinking about this more recently. In a way, it's sort of the route and the track mirror really the kind of thing that we're looking at in terms of HS2, in terms of fast railways, direct railways, high-speed railways. And so his conception was of a high-speed intercity railway, which had very flat gradients, which for railway locomotives are very important. There were places where the gradients were a bit more challenging just because of the geography, but the line coming out of London is very flat all the way to Swindon, and they used to call it Brunel's billiard table because it was so flat. But it was a high-speed railway with long sweeping curves. There weren't any tunnels. The first tunnel coming from London was literally in Box, which is almost on the outskirts of Bath. So again, those kind of engineering works weren't required. And also it was very grand in style. So if you look at the buildings that he built for the railway, he was making an architectural statement. So it wasn't just a workaday building. They were buildings that were landmark buildings because of really the way he thought the railway, the importance of the railway. So you get stations like Bristol Temple Meads, which was one of the first passenger terminuses, which is a very grand building in a sort of almost a medieval style. And then later on, of course, you've got Paddington Station, one of the largest terminuses ever built at that time. Almost like a cathedral, using that new technology of glass and cast iron. So his railway was sort of really making a statement, and nobody had ever really seen anything like it. And just to add it even more complication, he made the track gauge different. So railways had been built, and when I say track gauge, I mean the distance between the rails of a railway. Now, what's known as the standard gauge today, it's 4 foot 8.5 between the rails. Brunel's railway was built to what he called the broad gauge, and that means that the gap between the rails was 7 feet. So that was considerably different and not the same as any other railway that had ever been built. He'd done his research and felt that that was, again, helped him to run fast trains, larger trains. So it did make the GWR very distinctive, and I think that's the thing that comes across so strongly throughout.
Does it truly make a difference? Did it, in the sense, did it actually make the difference in reality rather than in theory and on paper?
That's a good question. They discussed this at a royal commission in 1845 and 1846 at great length, and in theory it did, because you had much. If you think about it, the carriages were bigger; they could carry more. They could carry more passengers, more goods, and the trains could be bigger and faster. But of course, the problem with the broad gauge was it was fine on its own, but when it met another gauge, there you had the problem. So we had these things called breaks of gauges at places like Oxford and Gloucester, where the rest of the railway world, essentially north of of Brunel's railways, were still building standard gauge railway lines. And so, of course, if you wanted to travel, for example, from Bristol to Birmingham, you travelled on a Brunel line up to Gloucester. Then you got off the train, you walked across the platform and got on a standard gauge train to go to Birmingham. And you can imagine how chaotic that might have been. And then add the complication of goods traffic. And that was an issue that was never really satisfactorily really agreed. Brunel had always had this idea that they could use containers, which is something that, of course, is common nowadays. I mean, shipping containers are used all the time, but in the 1840s, it really hadn't been talked about very much. So you can imagine how, again, the disruption of having to move goods from one wagon to the other. And there are lots of really lovely contemporary accounts. I found a great contemporary account in the British Library from a carter and who was essentially moving goods around the country, and he complained bitterly about the chaos at places like Gloucester, where his goods that he was moving were getting damaged, delayed. And you can imagine how labour intensive it was to move things. So, if the whole of the country had been built to broad gauge, it would have been wonderful. But the reality was that the broad gauge, even by the 1840s, was in hundreds of miles, whereas the standard gauge, there were thousands of miles of track, and they weren't going to convert it all to broad gauge at that point. And so eventually the government agreed that there should just be one gauge for the country, and it would be standard gauge. It took years to convert it, and it wasn't until 1892 that finally the broad gauge disappeared. And so that was a sort of relic of a remnant of Brunel's great idea. And like some of his great ideas, it cost the people who had to operate them money. And it probably cost the GWR millions of pounds in the end to convert over a long period. So not all his ideas were great. But going back to the 1840s, his self-contained GWR was a fantastic railway.
So he creates this amazing railway line. And what does he actually do next?
Well, it's interesting because when I was researching it, my book talks about, the empire of railways that he designed. And it's difficult to know whether he had a grand plan or whether it was more organic. The intention always seems to have been that he wanted to build essentially a network of railways that moved away from the Great Western, which initially just was from Bristol to London, with a branch the original line had a branch to Gloucester and Cheltenham noted, and a branch down to the south, probably through Trowbridge. And so, even before the GWR was completed in 1841, he was being commissioned to be the engineer of other railways that would link in all, and if they were his railways, they were naturally going to be broad gauge, with one exception, which I could come back to later. But a lot of these railways were independent companies, or nominally independent, what you usually find is that railways like, for example, the Bristol and Exeter Railway or the Bristol and Gloucester Railway had independent investors, but they also had investors and directors who were already involved with the Great Western. So the links, the GWR didn't take these companies over initially, but they had sometimes controlling interest, or certainly quite an interest in the running of these railways, which essentially were feeders. So, as the GWR was finished in 1841, you could start to get in railways into places like down to Taunton and into Cornwall, north into over the Cotswolds from Oxford up to Wolverhampton, and then south down into really into the south, going towards Weymouth and Salisbury. So the network started to gradually expand, and Brunel himself ended up as the engineer for a lot of these railways. Inevitably, as the 19th century progressed, these railways were absorbed by the Great Western themselves, because some of them were relatively small, and eventually they all became part of the GWR network. And a lot of them are still around now. So, a lot of the routes that you would travel to the West Country, the south, and to the north from here were all Brunel designs.
Just trying to find these maps, and apparently all I'm finding is Australia at this moment, because you've got me intrigued. I want to see what these railway lines look like. So while we're going to move on to the next question, I'm going to see if I can find some more maps to visualize this, because even though we're a podcast and we do everything by sound, it's still interesting to be able to look at certain things when you do podcasts. So I kind of get this kind of bug, and I'm like, oh my God, I have to know a bit more about this. So we'll move on to the next question. While we're doing so, as you're speaking, I'm going to have a look, and I would also advise some of our listeners, if they've got your books. I'm assuming your book also has the maps as well.
There is a map in the book showing the extent of the broad gauge, so that you can do that. And if Fabulous. I can find a link, I can maybe put a link onto for a map onto your podcast website, if that's helpful.
Perfect. We'll put a link into the description, because we all love a good map. I've just got to tell you, we just love a good map. So
we do. No, and I'm absolutely the same. So yeah, no, absolutely agree.
Okay, so here completes this line. Do Great Western at this point have ambitions to expand? Because you've touched on this already. Mm-hmm. Can we delve into this just a little bit deeper?
Mm-hmm. I think that they did up to a point. They did, but of course, there was this network of railways that were all independent to start with, because sometimes, certainly in the 19th century, a lot of the impetus for these railways came from the areas that they were serving. So, for example, the South Wales Railway, the impetus for that railway came from the business community in that area, who felt they ought to be linked to the rest of the country. The same with, say, the Bristol and Exeter Railway, which ran down through Somerset from Bristol, not surprisingly, to Exeter. Everybody at that period, everybody wanted to be linked to the railways, because railways were the coming thing. And so I guess the GWR probably did want to take over these companies, but certainly in those early days of the 1840s, they probably didn't have anywhere near the capital to do that. So they tended to have an interest in them, and they also had what railway historians would know as run-in powers, which meant that they could run their trains over those lines. And some of the lines, they actually entered into agreements where they would actually run the trains on behalf of the railway company. So the link was very organic, and as I said just recently, that ultimately the GWR took over these companies, but the capital required was huge. And of course, one thing to mention is that Brunel's line from Bristol to London was 2.5 times over budget when it was completed. It was originally going to be 2.8 million, and it ran very much over budget, as a lot of those projects did. Again, because nobody had ever really built a railway on that scale before, and costs, as we know, with large projects, even today, tend to overrun, and they were learning as they went along. So, the poor old shareholders of the Great Western Railway had to cough up that money and the company had to go out into the markets to get that extra capital to finish it. So, certainly by the time the GWR was opened in 1841, the railway company was probably not in a great position to be taking over huge numbers of other railways. But as time went on, obviously they were absorbed. So you find these big, as I say, these big companies, other railways were set up. And Brunel was he was a workaholic. He was always looking for work. And so when an opportunity came along, he took it. A great example of that is the Taff Vale Railway, which ran initially from Cardiff to Merthyr in South Wales. He was offered the opportunity to do that in the middle of, again, while he was building the GWR. I mean, one thing that comes across when you look at the research is, how Brunel actually fitted it all in is amazing, because, from the time that the Act of Parliament was passed for the GWR in 1835, he was then involved with the GWR, but then he took on the Taff Vale Railway in 1836. He was also designing his first steamship, the SS Great Western, and working on all sorts of other railway projects. So, how he did this juggling act is really hard. His poor old assistants must have been run ragged by requests for him. But you read his diaries and look at his appointment diaries, which are all very fascinating. And he was never in the office. He was either out on the road, surveying the route of a line, going to visit people. His work-life balance was pretty much stacked to work rather than play at that time.
Very interesting. So I've just found a map, and I'm looking at 1941 when the railway was completed from Bristol to London, because in the other maps, the consecutive maps, already it shows that little bit of gap between Bristol and London. And it's interesting to see how London and Portsmouth are connected, and Bristol and Birmingham and Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester, Nottingham and Newcastle by 1941. So that's, for that time period, literally within a matter of years, you've got all of this, I'm assuming hundreds and hundreds and thousands of miles of railway line.
It was that early period between sort of 1840 and 1860. That was really a point at which the railway network in the UK blossomed, and as you say, all those major towns and cities were linked up by railway companies. And part of it was through what we now know as the railway mania, when there was this huge boom in building. Yeah, I mean, that was the point at which all those major places started to do. And if you look at that map, I mean, the one big area that doesn't have very much in it is Wales. Certainly, there would hardly be any railways in Wales. So there were certainly gaps in the network. And sort of by the 1870s and 1880s, there were very few places in the UK that didn't have a link to a railway, whether it was a main line or a little branch line. And so there was a lot of duplication, and of course that then that sort of duplication came home to roost really in the 50s and 1950s and 1960s, when railways started to be cut back, because there was a lot of this competition was really duplication by railway companies. But certainly when Brunel was building and designing his railways, he was working in an environment where railways, a lot of these places had not been linked by railways, and so they were desperate to be part of the railway network. And if you think, for example, about Cornwall, which didn't actually get its railway network link really till 1859, poor old Cornwall was cut off, and you can imagine it was already a long way from London. And so the impact of the railway for people in Devon and Cornwall was huge, because that part of the country was finally linked to the capital and to the rest of the country, which again was a huge revolution.
It's incredible. It's got maps all the way up until 1911. And you look at the difference I think it's like every 5 to 10 years, these maps here. And suddenly you've got all of this yellow, and then you've got all of these red lines, and they just increase and increase and increase. But I've noticed that in 1879 and even in 1891, Scotland's been kind of forgotten about, really, especially the northern parts of Scotland.
A lot of that's to do with the geography, I think. So yeah, the number of railways particularly in that part of Scotland is fewer. But I think that the engineering difficulties of building railways in Scotland, were tremendous. And so yes, so some of the lines to the Highlands were quite late in terms of development, certainly in comparison to the rest of the country.
Right, enough of my ranting. Let's go back on track. So he ends up going to work on the South Railways line. God, that's like a South Railways line. Eventually, doesn't he, afterwards?
Yeah, I mean I think you mean the South Wales Railway, which is, yeah, I mean that's an even longer railway than the Great Western. When it was promoted in Parliament, it was much longer because it was going to run essentially from Gloucester right across to the west coast of Wales. And I mean that railway had really two drivers behind it. One of them was obviously the coal business in South Wales, because that was huge and starting, you were talking about the Industrial Revolution. So that by the 1840s, coal production was really ramping up. Not all of it was going to travel by boat, which a lot of it had done to the rest of the country. This was a huge market that could service. But there was also a further driver, which was being able to have a link to the south of Ireland, because maritime traffic across the Irish Sea would open up the markets of Southern Ireland, cattle, agricultural traffic, and so that was again one of the reasons that they wanted to build the railway. In the end, that the Irish traffic never really came to much, partly because of the tragedy of the famine in Ireland, which then affected the economy of Ireland really dramatically. But the original idea was to have a terminus at Fishguard, right on the West Wales coast, which would link then over to Rosslare. But that was abandoned, and they ended up building a station in Pembroke Harbour, a place called Neyland, meant that trains could run right through. But the South Wales took a while to build, partly because Brunel originally had the idea of building a bridge across the River Severn to get to from England to Wales, which was dismissed by the authorities because they felt it would obstruct shipping going up and down the River Severn. It's ironic that eventually, obviously, there are two Severn crossings now, road crossings, and he even had the idea of building a tunnel under the River Severn, which again came to pass a few years later. So that eventually he had to admit that they'd have a rather roundabout way to get to Wales, which was to essentially come from London, stop at Swindon, go over to Cheltenham and Gloucester, and then from Gloucester to come down the coast of South Wales through Chepstow, Cardiff, Swansea, and on from there. And one of the biggest projects that he did on that line, which was a fantastic bridge across the River Wye at Chepstow, which was one of his engineering triumphs, and really helped him to test his ideas out. It's made of wrought iron. And the things that he learned from that, he used then probably on his best known bridge, which is the Royal Albert Bridge, which crosses the River Tamar between Devon and Cornwall. And you were mentioning about things that have survived, and the Royal Albert Bridge is probably one of his engineering masterpieces, a huge bridge that crosses the River Tamar. So the Chepstow Bridge took a while to build, but once that had been completed, again, people could travel to the capital from Wales very quickly. But again, we mentioned the gauge. Ironically, the amount of coal that they ended up shifting was relatively modest, because all the railways that were running from the coal mines down to the coast, they were standard gauge. So they tended to go over or under Brunel's railway, which ran sort of east-west across the coast of South Wales. So most of the coal ended up being transported by other railways, and not the South Wales or the GWR. So, which was a great shame. Fortunately, the South Wales was a relatively prosperous company, and unlike the GWR, he actually brought it in on budget, which was certainly something to be admired, unlike some of his projects.
I mean, you've mentioned some of his struggles already, so it wasn't all rainbows and cupcakes and posies for him. He obviously had a very difficult life at the beginning because you've got the severe failings, especially including the SS Great Eastern and the gauge wars, as you literally mentioned moments ago. How did these actually end up affecting his work and his health?
Well, I think I've sort of already mentioned that his method of working was quite tough, because he was a very strong character, and if there's a huge debate, certainly amongst Brunel historians, there is a big debate about how he treated people, the way he worked, and like a lot of creative people, he wasn't the easiest man to work for. And he was, some people would, if you were taking an extreme view, say he was a megalomaniac, but he was certainly, in the Victorian viewpoint, he was the man who was in control. One of his biggest failings was that he found it really difficult to delegate. So, of course, everything that he worked on, every bit of paperwork tended to come across his desk, and his assistants really would then struggle to make decisions without his say so, because they were frightened that he wouldn't agree with him. So he tended to work long hours. Certainly in those early days, he would work long hours, checking correspondence, writing to people, seeing things. I mean, in the Brunel Institute here at the SS Great Britain, we've got many of his sketchbooks and notebooks and his diaries and his work diaries, so you can see the kind of days that he tended to have. And that must have had an effect on his health. He changed his views sort of by the sort of late 1840s. I think even he had realised that he couldn't go on working 20-hour days, sleeping in a carriage as he was going from place to place. And he did try to change his work style a little. And we've got the diaries from when he had an office in Duke Street in London, and he would tend to do sort of a week of meetings, and he would have meetings from 7 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, one after the other, with different people. And then he might go he had a house in Torquay that he rented. He would go down to Devon maybe for the weekend, or have some time off. But that kind of frantic pace really started to get to him. And then he was involved, the Gauge War was, there was a parliamentary commission. Brunel was heavily involved in arguing the case for the broad gauge, and then he was involved with steamships. The Great Western I already mentioned. The Great Britain launched in 1843, and then the Great Eastern, which was his final ship, which he started to think about in the early 1850s. And it was the biggest ocean liner in the world. It was on an enormous scale. And that was a project that really put a strain on his health, on his physical and mental health, really. The company, again, I'm starting to repeat myself, was short of money. They struggled to get the money to build this massive ship. He worked with another maritime engineer, John Scott Russell, and they famously had a difficult relationship. And when it came to trying to launch the ship, I'm sure some of the podcast listeners will know, they couldn't get the ship off the side of the River Thames where it was being built, and it took almost 6 months to actually float the ship off, and that was a very difficult time for Brunel. But also, he was, as I've mentioned earlier, he was working on multiple things at any one time, which must have put a strain on him, and his health was never good. He'd had this rescue in the Thames, Thames Tunnel, which had involved him having quite a lot of time to convalesce. And then he had several close shaves. I mean, one of the other things that comes across in the book is that he was incredibly lucky. He when he was involved working on the SS Great Western steamship, they took the ship out into the Bristol Channel for a test, and there was a fire in the engine room. Brunel, in typical fashion, went to investigate, stepped on the ladder, which was made of wood, and fell into the hold of the ship. fortunately for him, landing on one of his colleagues who broke his fall, but then landing in there. He was also involved. One of the things that I discovered in my research was that he was involved in a serious train crash in 1845 when a train came off the track coming out of London. And I think most of the carriages went down the embankment. Brunel fortunately escaped from that. And then, of course, you've got his famous habit, which was smoking cigars. And he famously would smoke between 20 and 40 cigars a day, which couldn't have done his health a lot of good either. So, it's not surprising that, I mean, he died at the age of 53, which is, considering that he was not a very, very affluent man, but certainly quite affluent, was quite a young age, really, for him.
I don't know if he was lucky, unlucky, smart, or I don't know. I'm struggling for words with this man right now. How many things did he should have, he's a cat. He must have had some sort of 9 lives.
He really must have done. I mean, I think he lived life at the edge, I think, sometimes. And then there's and something I didn't mention as well, which is another well publicized thing, is that he did spend some time at home with his kids, and he loved doing conjuring tricks. And he famously did with the trick which you quite often see magicians doing, which is to try and look like you're swallowing a coin and then bringing it out of your ear. And he was doing this with his children with a half sovereign, except that he swallowed the half sovereign, and it was lodged in his trachea. And it took weeks to eventually dislodge this. I mean, it could have been incredibly, it could have been the end of him. And in typical fashion, he invented a little contraption, which was like essentially a large board which could be pivoted, which they turned upside down. So he was turned upside down, and the surgeon started to essentially hit him on the back. And eventually the coin was dislodged from his trachea and dropped out into his mouth. And you can tell the kind of it made the newspaper headlines. People were, the coin is out. Mr. Brunel's coin has been dislodged. So again, that was a close call by many fetch of the imagination.
Well, this intelligent, brave, very lucky man is considered to be one of the Victorians' greatest engineers. What do you personally think of his legacy?
It's a complicated question, that I think that's the thing about him, and we've just sort of really been talking about that. I think he was, the traditional engineer as hero image that you have of people like Brunel. I think that's changed a little bit. He was a man of with so many different roles and so many different bits of character. So his legacy was really the engineering genius and the design of the buildings and the things that we can see now. You go to Paddington Station, it's a fantastic place to look. The bridges that you can see, the tunnel through Box Hill, just outside of Bath, 2 miles through solid limestone. Nobody had really done anything quite like that before. He was a pathfinder, and so I think the thing is that his legacy is still with us. The fact that he set up this network of railways. You were talking about the maps. You look at the map of the railway network today in the south of England and the west of England, it's all Brunel. Pretty much all of it is Brunel, and it's still there. So he laid the foundations for railways as we know them now, and a lot of his buildings have still survived because they were well made. A lot of them are listed buildings because people they were built to last and they're solid, but they have flair. And nothing Brunel did really was work a day. That was not his style. As I said at the beginning, he said that the GWR was going to be the finest work in England, and that was his idea. He always said, I'll build you a railway. It doesn't necessarily have to be the cheapest, but it will be the best. And that sort of attention to detail is something that really, has meant that things have lasted. But he was a conundrum. He was like, to get his results, he was a hard man to live with. But then again, maybe of his time, the idea of Brunel certainly would struggle in the work environment today. But having said that, I mean, people described him as very charming. I'm not entirely sure that all of his assistants would have necessarily said that when he was in a bad mood. But he could be a very charming. He was cultured. He was a man of the arts. So he was a sort of all-round, really, polymath, which is why people are still interested in him, I guess. That some of the 19th century railway engineers that did important work, they didn't probably have the kind of public image that he had in his lifetime and since his lifetime. I mean, the fact that we're still talking about him today, is something. And you look at, on my book is only one of a series of books on him since the 1950s. And I describe in my introduction that I couldn't have done it without the fantastic things that have been written about him before. But he's always somebody you can find something new, shed new light on and talk about to a new audience. And I think that's the interesting thing, that it's a story that will continue right into the future. And railways are going to be with us despite all the politicking that's going on at the moment. Long distance rail travel is what we need in this country. And I think again, the engineers who built Crossrail, the engineers who are looking at HS2 and all those things there, all that sort of goes back to the time of Brunel, really.
Tim, this has been absolutely excellent. I have had an incredible social history rather than technology, which has been fantastic for me because can't wrap my head around all those technical things. I think Brunel was a very interesting and very complicated man, and he is well worth remembering. He's left such an incredible legacy and he's done such incredible things that shouldn't be forgotten. So could you just remind our listeners the name of your book?
My book is called Iron, Stone and Steam, Brunel's Railway Empire. So it's
Fabulous.
Yeah.
We will get that into our bookshop. So we help our local bookstores. You get a slice, we get a slice, and that company beginning with A in the South Americas will not be getting a cut to build their rocket into space.
Wonderful.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.